here today with Yasha Klots, who is a professor of Russian literature at Hunter College at the City University of New York. And Yasha is joining me today to talk about his current focus, which is Thomisdot literature. And he's looking at the circulation, reception, and first publication of manuscripts from the Soviet Union in the West. So Soviet-era literature of this type, which is called Thomisdot, is often written by dissident writers. It's smuggled out of Russia and then published abroad and then returned to Russia. So we're going to get into more of that, and Yasha will explain what Thomisdot really is in a minute. But Yasha also currently has two forthcoming books, one an edited volume loosely based on a conference he organized on Thomisdot, which is coming out next month, and then his book, Thomisdot, The Cold War and Contraband Russian Literature, which is still a work in progress. And Yasha is also the creator of the online Thomisdot project, which is a catalog of Thomisdot authors, publishers, and books. So Yasha, thank you so much for joining me. If you could just start us off by defining the words Thomisdot, Samizdat, and Gasizdat, so that people know what we're talking about here. And then just tell us, what are the newer, more unfamiliar elements of Thomisdot that you are talking about and bringing forth in your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you, Sasha, so much for inviting me. It gives me a special pleasure to talk with you on this topic, which you have been somewhat familiar with since times as a Thomisdot project participant at Hunter College in New York. But yes, so these three neologisms, right, these three words, perhaps only one of which does not really require a translation anymore, that is Samizdat, one of these concepts that have made it into English language as well as other languages from a somewhat unfamiliar from today's perspective reality, which is the late Soviet era, the Cold War era, which is rather remote from us today, at least historically, but that concept stayed, right? So Samizdat, to start with this one, the more familiar one, it literally means self-published, but not in a chapbook way, as we are used to understanding this self-published books here. It's really not a publication. These are manuscripts, handwritten or typed, that the initiated audience, that is a rather narrow circle of readers, of the insiders, let's say, of those circles in the Soviet Union, and not only of course, other countries of the former socialist bloc, but in other languages it may have been called differently, which those readers not only read, but also themselves, literally while they're reading it for the first time, or the same night, or let's say the same week, they keep reproducing those manuscripts on their own typewriters or in longhand and continue to disseminate them further. And usually the technology of those days, that was a typewriter, would usually take 5 carbon copies, and that's kind of the geometrical progression of this process of how Samizdat, or underground literature, was disseminated within, once again, a very narrow circle of friends, essentially, or like-minded groups of people, with somewhat exclusive access, of course, to what is considered underground for conspiracy purposes, for their own safety's sake, and such things, because of course it was reprehensible and very often punishable, legally persecuted. So this is Samizdat, self-published. The key thing here is that it is local, that it stays within the state jurisdiction, or within one domestic geography, let's put it this way. Gasizdat, kind of a foil to Samizdat, perhaps the most direct mere reflection of Samizdat, is conversely literature texts that are officially sanctioned for publication. And when I say officially sanctioned, it's not just a blank, empty phrase. In the Soviet Union, as well as in Soviet Poland and Soviet Baltic states and the Czech Republic, etc., to get anything published officially, this work had to have the approval of the state censorship. So this is Gosizdat. Of course, it is not, has never been as clear-cut as it seems, like official, non-official, underground, above ground. Of course, there were lots of areas of kind of ideological overlap, let's say, intermediary cases and texts that used all kinds of techniques to get the work published, even if it was very subversive.
What were some of those techniques? Maybe you could briefly explain what were some of those techniques?
Sure. Well, people resorted to something that is most generally called Aesopian language, for instance, right? We all know the Aesop tales, which tell us about the lives of animals, behind which, of course, lurk kind of the images of the humans, of human behavior, human cunning, and all kinds of vices and virtues, etc. Right? This does not clearly have to be about animals, right? To talk about humans, it could be, a text could be, for instance, talking about the Inquisition, something as remote in history as the Inquisition. But behind this, there would be hints at the contemporary Soviet reality. This is in time, right? Kind of temporal removal, let's say, from the immediate context. It could also be talking about a different geography. Something that a text whose plot, let's say, would be a text with a setting on an uninhabited island or in the outer space, for example, right? Which of course has no relation whatsoever to the contemporary, well, current Soviet politics or geography. But then again, the aliens would be saying things that an initiated Soviet reader would relate to.
Right. So there's something analogous to the topical issues.
Right, of course. So it's essentially a figure of speech, right, or a troll, if you'd like, which compares in this or that way something that is A and something that is B. A in this case being a different planet, and B in this case being this very reality in which the reader is immersed. So this is how some of the subversive underground or simply apolitical, texts with sexual content, for instance, which was of course banned as well. Explicit sexual content was not permitted. This is how they would get into print, into the official Soviet press. Gosizdat. But then mainly Gosizdat is of course known for, well, very faithful, politically upright, the Soviet canon, right? Socialist realism, the officially prescribed aesthetic method, etc. Which is, again, not to say that it was all entirely bad. Of course not. There are masterpieces of socialist realism. Well, from today's perspective, at least, they seem not so bad as they were somewhat derogatorily perceived back in the days by the dissidents. So this leaves us with Tamizdat. Tam in Russian is just a particle that means there, published over there, right? That is abroad. But because it is still officially published, right? It is the source of Tamizdat was most often the underground manuscripts. But then the way they were emancipated, let's say, and brought all this way from the drawer to publication, even though the publication would take place elsewhere in a different geography and jurisdiction, this still makes it an official publication. So in a sense, Tamizdat combined the elements of both. Samizdat and Gossesdat, except kind of with the opposite, perhaps ideological leaning in relation to Gossesdat, because we are talking here about the Cold War period. And of course, the more anti-Soviet, anti-communist such a text would be, the more groundbreaking resonance, right? It would acquire once published in Tamizdat. And this is very unfortunate because some of the texts that do not stand out so much politically, but are absolute masterpieces, they would very often get overshadowed by something like Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, for instance, which is a very strange book, 3 volumes, not just because of its size, but because of its aesthetic qualities. But then there would be, on the other hand, Varlam Shalamov, another Gulag author who wrote in very different form and was really not about exposing the vices of communism, right? He was writing about the existential condition of a prisoner on the verge of death, let's put it this way. And that
books that were very blatantly critical of communism and the Soviet regime would be welcomed in the West, and then you're saying those were kind of made more prominent because of the political,
yes,
use,
exactly.
even as propaganda potentially.
It was propaganda, of course. There was Soviet propaganda, there was anti-Soviet propaganda. Surprise, surprise. But that was the climate of those days. And today, it is, of course, a historical phenomenon and a historical problem that I'm trying to kind of unmask as much as possible. Because on top of everything, all these operations were very often secret, starting with smuggling out those manuscripts out of the country and smuggling them back in. Of course, it is sometimes rather difficult to establish the exact kind of chain of stages of this process or the names of the people involved. But the history of every manuscript makes a detective story in its own right, in a sense. And they were often detective stories because such a transgression was literally a crime from the perspective of the Soviet jurisdictions whose subjects were those authors, right? Who would be in the Soviet Union, but secretly sending their works abroad, or when their works would turn up abroad and published even without their knowledge or consent, which is the kind of cliche that many Western publishers used, so sort of to protect those authors, because they apparently did not know, which makes the crime less serious.
Right. And what were some of the consequences for Tamizdat authors?
It really depended on so many factors that it's hard to generalize. Perhaps the harshest one and the most notorious one was a prison sentence of 7 and 5 years, respectively, to 2 writers. Their names are Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, who published abroad for a very long time, for almost 8 years, under pseudonyms, under pen names of Abram Terz and Nikolai Arzhak. And no one cared, then no one could figure out who they were. And it was maintained in almost impeccable secrecy. So the people who stood behind those publications were professional, even though they were not professional conspirators, right? They were simply responsible people, let's put it this way. But then this was what it ended up with, this whole story in 1966, which had a huge global resonance and kind of marks the end of this period of relative freedom in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin and until about this year, 1966-68, which is called the thaw, like a meteorological metaphor that describes this decade. But there would be the opposite cases, for example, with Joseph Brodsky, right, the fifth Russian Nobel Prize winner for literature, who emigrated to the US in 72, but had his first book published in 65 without his knowledge or consent. And not only nothing happened to him at the time, it so happens that a year before he had been condemned to internal exile, not prison, but still forced labor, for so-called social parasitism, which had nothing to do with his publications abroad. It was simply a repressive measure because he didn't fit in and irritated the authorities with his behavior and with his non-standard, non-socialist realist writing. But then when the book was out in Washington, it not only did it not gain him a harsher sentence, he was released several months after this. So it went completely ignored.
Okay, why did that go the other way for him?
Sorry?
Why did it go in that direction for him?
It simply was not a factor. Somehow. Well, because again, because of many other factors involved here, but it varied. Lots of Soviet authors were suggested to write letters of repentance, for instance, in Soviet newspapers, kind of condemning those publications of their works in the hostile capitalist world. Some of them did this, some of them didn't. Some of them, to be honest, did this genuinely, because the quality of Tamizdat and the kind of piracy of Tamizdat, right? Much of it was piracy, went against their author's will, not to mention the technical aspect of those publications. It was very often infested with typos. It was very often short-sightedly received and read. The criticism of Tamizdat was ideologically biased. It is not a secret, of course, and books were used essentially as weapons on the cultural fronts of the Cold War, which explains so many things here.
Yes, and that leads me into something else I wanted to ask you about, which is kind of the connection in Russia in particular and in the Soviet Union of the connection between art and politics and kind of what you make of that. I mean, even maybe you could also speak about the importance of literature to Russian culture and society before the Soviet Union and during kind of that that mixing, which maybe people here don't quite fully understand the closeness of politics and literature, because we don't really have that here in the same way.
It's an excellent point you just made, of course. And this tradition is much longer than the Soviet era, than Tamizdat, than Samizdat. It goes back, well, it's as old as Russian literature itself. And it's true, literature and, well, philosophy alongside literature and social commentary, of course, has always had more weight in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Empire. And then perhaps only now does it start kind of losing this status, fortunately or unfortunately. Perhaps fortunately, because literature is different from politics and it has its own tasks. But it is true that it has always assumed extra literary function, right, in the Soviet Union and again in the 19th century in Russia, because of clearly the political system of the Russian Empire, which was a monarchy, and then of the Soviet Union, which was not as democratic as it called itself on the surface, right? It always had the strong leaders, if not to call them autocrats or tyrants, in which, under whom, let's say, free law is only free nominally, but then it is, of course, subordinate to the will of the ruling elite. Be it the Tsar or Stalin, or even Khrushchev, who was his successor during the years of the thaw. It was all very, very vertical, and literature, by definition, cannot be as hierarchical as a governmental system. So it always created this field in which public opinion could maneuver and could be shaped and manipulated, and
it provides a way for people to criticize the regimes, right? Like, as you were referencing earlier, maybe it was cloaked in analogies or something like that, but it kind of gave that outlet to be critical.
Well, clearly, of course, maybe criticism is one of the functions of literature everywhere. But under those conditions, it was, you're right, it was perhaps the only way to express criticism, especially indirectly, because direct criticism could not live long. Yeah, so, and it is this very subtle and way of conducting, right, a public opinion through the hoops of censorship and the repressive government system. Of course, it was not the only way. Well, there is another neologism dating back to about the same years. Magnet is that. Magnet meaning vinyl, right? Or so this was underground dissemination of audio recordings, and people would record, or in the CD age, we used to call it burn CDs, right? This was something where they used X-rays. Literally from the hospitals, they would go for an X-ray of their lungs, take the X-ray itself, this sheet, and use it to record music in kind of homemade recording studios. Pretty much like the typewriter, except it was a different technology. So this was fascinating just as well.
How did it work, I'm curious, with writers who wanted to be published through the state-sanctioned publications? I mean, so they write their work and then they submit it for censorship. How did that whole process look like?
Well, we assume that every author wants to publish, no matter what it takes, right? But this is precisely what was at stake. What exactly does it take for you to get published? How much compromise or selling out are you ready to undertake to achieve this ultimate goal as a writer? Well, in the earlier Soviet period, for instance, in the 20s and 30s, when censorship was already reinstated, I'm saying reinstated because Tsarist censorship in the 19th century was also quite harsh. Authors like Boris Pasternak, the author of the famous and first Tamizdat novel, really, Dr. Zhivago, even Mandelstam, and countless other, first of all, poets and, well, authors, they would resort to translation. Pasternak would be translating Shakespeare. Of course, what you read as a result is more Pasternak than Shakespeare. but it was a pretty unique school of Soviet translation was formed thereby, because translation was not Pasternak's own text, so he could take more liberties, greater liberties. And then you find all kinds of Aesopian hints in Shakespeare.
That's interesting.
A couple of centuries before, and could not have possibly been commenting, of course, on the Soviet age and regime, right? But through his translator, Boris Pasternak, it so happened that Shakespeare became much more relatable to the Soviet readers. Well, this happens with translation always, of course, but that story had its own specificity. So translation was one. Then there was children's literature. Soviet children's literature is quite phenomenal, precisely because non-children's adult literature was so much repressed. Yeah, so we have all these incredible, mind-boggling, politically mind-boggling texts in the guise of children's stories.
What are some examples of those?
Well, Osip Mandelstam would write about a tram in Petrograd or Petersburg, right? Something that most children are genuinely interested in this means of public transportation. But then the tram would be personified, right? It would acquire its own individuality, personality. It would be animated. So respectively, it would start developing feelings, including civic consciousness, etc. So it's a journey at the same time, right? Children really like when things move, and that was a channel, right, for Mandelstam, who could not express it directly, to say at least so much, right? Yeah, but then getting back to your question, then there was a period in the late 70s and 80s called the stagnation era, right? When nothing really was happening. There was no longer any thaw warming up the literary scene. And yet it was no longer Stalinism, of course. It was very repressive, true, but it was not 1937. And in this kind of stagnant condition, lots of authors simply stopped submitting their works for publication in Dissident, knowing it would be hopeless. And that was the rise of Samizdat on the one hand, but also of Tamizdat. So the division between the underground and Tamizdat and Dissident perhaps was the greatest during this period of the late 70s and 80s. And then, of course, it all ends in the late 80s with the fall of the wall, 89, but perhaps formally in 91 when the Soviet Union collapses, 2 years after the fall of the wall. And Tamizdat becomes simply obsolete. The Iron Curtain has been up, lifted, censorship becomes rather economic censorship than political. So this is what so many Soviet authors complained about when they came to the US, emigrated, that there we were banned for political reasons, we come here, and it's all the same except it's economic. Well,
and what do you mean by that, canonical?
A book needs to sell. How sellable, how many copies can you sell if you write about the Soviet reality, which an average American reader was familiar with only vaguely, unless it's Solzhenitsyn, right? Again, who really brings it to the forefront. But this was simply a misunderstanding, of course, of how different American publishing is, how differently it works. And it is a tragedy, of course, for these authors who thereby prove themselves being almost inextricably products of the Soviet culture.
Mm.
And understandably so, because they physically could not afford even seeing any other reality during their lifetimes until and if they emigrated physically
Mm.
from the Soviet Union in the 70s.
Mm. And you mentioned how there was, this idea of if you choose to go through the official channel, you're looked down upon by the underground writers, which, makes sense. You're something of a sellout. But yeah, could you talk more about the dynamics and how that showed in the writing of the different choices that authors would make? Like if they're going to be attempt to go through Gosisdat and be, censored, or if they're going to do the underground local dissident version of publishing and distributing Samizdat, or if they're going to try to get it out. So what was the cultural, those differences between the writers? What were the different views there amongst them?
Well, it's pretty hard to generalize because the decision ultimately depends on the individual author's temperament, maybe, of all things. But to give one example, Andrei Bitov with his novel Pushkin House, right, which is set during the Soviet times and in Soviet Leningrad, right, and is all kind of centered around this Institute of Russian Literature called Pushkinsky Dom, the Pushkin House. It's not outright critical, right? It's there is nothing in it that may have served as kind of a sword in the eye of the Soviet censor. And yet it's not Soviet enough, right? It does not follow closely the stencil of socialist realism, including the ideological element as well as the aesthetic one, because socialist realism was an aesthetic system put at the service, of course, of the ideological one, but nonetheless. So what would happen with writers like this? They would be offered compromises, and sometimes they would be allowed to publish parts of this novel, of such a novel, in Soviet journals, but not as a book length, not as a standalone book publication, which again goes against their creative design. It's not how they wrote it. They wrote it as a novel, right? Novels usually get published separately, even though they may be serialized. Some of them would, many of them would agree, but then it would only be in Tamizdat abroad that their same text would first see the light of day as a standalone book. So that is one of the borderline cases. The famous masterpiece, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which he wrote shortly and literally during, as he was dying in 1940. That's when he died, and that's when he stopped writing it. It's finished, but it had not been known, had not been published until all of a sudden in 1966, in the December issue of the journal Moskva, and then in the following January issue of the same journal, this novel is published, except, well, in a censored form, right? 2 months later, it comes out in Paris in an uncensored form, right?
It might be interesting to explain the specifics of that, which parts they chose to run and which they didn't.
Right. Well, obviously, The Master and Margarita is a novel that has two plots. One is set in Moscow of the 1930s, and of course is very transparently related to Bulgakov's own reality of the Soviet Union during those years. The other plot is in the Judea. It's pretty much a rewriting of the Gospels with alternate modified names of Christ and Pontius Pilate and the apostles. And the two plots clearly are in a dialogue with each other. One is the reflection of the other and vice versa. And in the atheist state that the Soviet Union was, it was a problem. In fact, the novel begins, the opening chapter begins with a faithful, loyal Soviet poet being commissioned a poem about Jesus Christ, with the task of not proving or disproving whether Christ was right, but with the task of simply saying that he never existed. So it's kind of very poignant from the very outset, the novel. This still made it into the Soviet print, but with kind of cuts of, with the most poignant parts cut out. The Soviet censors, to be fair, did their job very well, right? It's quite impressive, this almost jewelry type of work that they would perform on a text. So this is one. But then there would be someone like Anna Akhmatova, a Silver Age Russian poet, born still in the 19th century, and someone who lived through pretty much as much as the Soviet century had to offer, who was published in the 60s and 70s as a lyrical poet, but not as the author of, again, much more historically and politically poignant texts such as Requiem, for instance. Requiem for the victims of the Great Terror during Stalin. That was too much, of course. And again, not because it was anti-Stalinist. Solzhenitsyn's first novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, is also about the victims of Stalinism, but it was written differently, right? So it could make it into Soviet print, and it did, because of how it was written, not because of what it was about. Yeah.
And we see, I kind of want to bring it a bit up to the modern day and connect it with, our current situation. And although I know that's not, specifically your focus, but when I think about today's climate in American publishing, it's very censorious, not in the same way, obviously, completely different way, very much more through capitalist like you mentioned before. They only sell books to make a profit, obviously. And but there's a very narrow margin of what they believe will make a profit or what they want to put out there these days, in mainstream publishing. And I kind of often lament, like, what books are we missing out right now? What literature are we not getting to read because of this industry where the professionals are very conformist and careful to keep everything within these narrow confines, these narrow ideological confines? But on the other hand, as I was thinking about Thomas Dot, preparing for this interview, there's perhaps something to be said for censorship kind of pushing creativity through this, underground community of dissident writers. I mean, what do you think of that? Was there kind of almost like a silver lining, in a sense, to the heavy censorship?
Of course, that's extremely interesting, and that's maybe what makes it really interesting as a subject of one's research, and just as an experience of reading these texts. It's a double-sided phenomenon, censorship. Yes, on the one hand, it's extremely repressive, and no one benefits from texts being censored and banned. On the other hand, because it's such a, creativity finds its way. And those Aesopian techniques I've been talking about, of course, they would not have been as developed, right, and as effective, let's say, efficient creatively, had it not been born out of this necessity, out of the desperate need, right, to get through censorship. There is a fascinating book written by a Russian poet who emigrated in 1976 to the US, Lev Losev. It's called On the Beneficence of Censorship. He is very far, of course, from arguing that censorship is beneficial. Clearly not. It's not beneficial. Let's not kind of stretch it that far. But this is exactly what he explores in this book, the techniques that are products of that political and ideological climate in which those texts were written. So it does shape some form of creative expression, respectively. Whether or not this would happen under capitalist or economic censorship is a very interesting question. And it probably is too different in its kind of origin. And maybe it is not, maybe it is wrong to call it censorship after all, because if it's market economy, then, well, it's competition perhaps rather than censorship.
But there is also a burgeoning of this ideological.
This is different, right?
Yeah.
This is adjacent, right? And probably overlaps, after all, does result in books being published or not, or sold or not. And if you're talking about, well, there are also things like fashion. Of course, this is only natural. Things do go in and out of fashion. But it is true. I mean, the usage of certain vocabulary has not become publishable in this country and probably everywhere, even in Russia today. It is something that I think your and my, maybe even generation, will still have to figure out in the future. So we are living in this very interesting moment of well, ideological change, let's put it this way. It is, of course, ideological. There is no doubt here. But what stands behind this, what drives this ideological change, is perhaps too dangerous to compare to what drove ideological change in the Soviet Union. Or at least it does not live through such a long segments of time as it did in the Soviet Union, right? We had a very unfortunate period in American history just recently, but it was, thanks God, only 4 years. So it's different. 4 years is a very short time for culture, right? It does not really, it creates a lot of things, but it does not really change things irreversibly, right? As 70 years would. So I have to be an expert on American contemporary poetry, for instance. I do go to readings and I do listen to it sometimes, but it is still a bit different because, well, it's a culture of insiders, right? American poetry is read pretty much by poets who write poems themselves. And the consumption of poetry is completely different from the audiences that Soviet poets had. At the same
that it's
time,
more of like a smaller cohort of just people who are really interested in that, as opposed to just general people who would have taken more of an interest.
At least that's my impression. And maybe it is a very healthy environment for literature, because literature, coming back to what we talked about earlier, it does not need to engineer human minds, on a mass scale. That's not what it's for. And
perhaps that's the mistake of the either whether it's like the desire for socialist realism or like today in a certain ideological narrative about race or gender or something like that. It's they're trying to engineer the way people think.
Thanks for saying this. And yeah, because in this case, well, one thing is very obvious, is that creativity and aesthetics, you can probably feel intuitively when it's put at the service of a higher purpose, right? Of at the service of, if not state commission, then public, not public opinion, of course, but public demand, right? It caters to, it responds to, but rather than shaping, right? Literature probably shapes public opinion rather than responds to it. Even though we are getting into a very scholastic debate, no one has figured it out so far, and probably we wouldn't be able to do so. But at least it's very interesting, of course, to think about this, which way it goes more, and what is. But yet again, this is nothing new, and there was ideology, has always been. It keeps changing. This time it is very much about race, ethnicity, gender. But essentially it is an ideology, of course.
And do you think we have, things to learn from Tamizdat when we're looking at today's publishing climate?
First of all, it is not an exclusively Russian or Soviet phenomenon. Take Germany in the late 30s at least, and onward until, or East Germany, which is still Germany. Take South America, I personally don't know enough about Southeast Asia and the works of China, where publishing is still not free. In Russia, it is more or less free right now. Journalism isn't, mass media aren't, but book publishing, poetry is. So it is not an exclusively Russian phenomenon, and it is not an exclusively Soviet era phenomenon. It has been happening, and it is happening elsewhere in the world. So of course there is a lot to learn from it, except you need to really inscribe it into global history and global politics and global literature to be able to draw lessons from a specific case, such as the Russian/Soviet Tamizdat. If that's what one is capable of doing, then yes, there are lessons. As much as there are lessons about Soviet Tamizdat from Germany of the era of Reformation, right? That is in fact when it all started, because that's when books were banned in Europe pretty much for the first time, on a specific territory. But then there is something that no Soviet author could have possibly imagined, and that overlaps in time with the dissolution of Samizdat and the socialist bloc and the Soviet Union, and with the lifting of the Iron Curtain, it's internet. So this historical change is probably much more technological than political, because we do not have a perfect political environmental world in the world, let alone Putin's Russia today. Let's be honest, it is very far from what we really wanted it to become in the 90s and onward. But there is technology, and for this reason, there is no Tamizdat anymore. It simply does not come back because there is.
Right, you wrote about how the entire difficult, long process of taking Tamizdat out, smuggling it out, publishing it, bringing it back, that now it can just be done in a few clicks.
Of course,
almost
just
anyone.
a few clicks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if it takes using VPN,
right,
or even if it takes using social media, which are of course controlled much more than other sectors of the internet, I imagine, it is still impossible to control. Yeah. Well, again, as far as I know, or at least so far, it has not been possible. So how many lessons and what kinds of lessons can we draw from Tamizdat era, and to what extent can we project them on cybersecurity and kind of cyberspace in general? That's interesting, because this has an entirely different inner mechanism, right? This online publishing.
Right, because a large part of Tamizdat is the technical, the logistical aspects of it, right? I mean, like actually taking the manuscripts and getting them published. And so that completely changes now. The entire nature of having to hide things underground, just technologically, logistically, will take different skills and different knowledge to figure it out.
It would require an entirely incomparable distance from, let's say, the book to its reader. That distance is no longer spatial, it's virtual, it's not geographical. So once geography is gone, pretty much, in the global world that internet aspires to create, yeah, it's just a different category. But nevertheless, even though virtual, it is still, we call it cyberspace, cloud, whatever it is, wherever it is still, of course, very much manipulated and controlled, and is pretty far from what it initially aspired to become. Freedom of speech incarnate, that's what internet was for. And yet we've gone pretty far from that ideal already in only 30 years or so.
Yeah.
So we will see, perhaps there are lessons.
Yeah. One thing that's, I don't know if this, has bearing on Tamizdat, but specifically, but one thing about internet censorship that I've learned, that I've noticed, is that it causes a massive amount of self-censorship and also preference falsification. So people just kind of choosing to believe and go along with certain ideology because they know they'll be censored otherwise. I mean, people will have their accounts removed or blocked, or they'll lose their jobs, or they'll lose friends, and because of what they express, usually online. So, I mean, that is different from official censorship, right? Like they don't even need to shut people up at that point.
It's true, and you're probably right here calling it censorship, because one of the symptoms of censorship is self-censorship. If there is serious censorship, state censorship, then of course it would inevitably generate self-censorship, at least until people are who they are psychologically, and have not developed into a whole different species. So self-censorship was very much in place and was a very important factor for authors writing in the Soviet Union under state censorship. The bigger difference is probably between the nature of public space before social media and after, because social media is public space and yet not quite, and it's hard to navigate for Facebook users where they enter a public space or where it's just their personal page. And that's what creates this dissonance, in my view at least.
So speaking of the internet, you have the Tommy's Project, which is this online archive of Tommy's works. So just to start to wrap up our conversation, could you explain just what this project is and what do you want people to know about it? Because, you know, I'll encourage viewers to go and check out the Tommy's Project. It's this incredible collection of all these works, and you can click through and see, you know, what was published and the different covers of the books and different editions and things like that. So yeah, what do you want people to know about the Tommy's Project?
I want people to know that it exists. Ironically, dealing with print culture and print editions, it resorts to digital means. Because this is how it's most ironically most natural to do it, to carry out such a project nowadays. It is a work in progress and probably will be always, given the scale of Tamizdat, by which I mean that about 70% perhaps of 20th century Russian literary canon was first published abroad, of the contemporary canon, of course. All those things we teach and read in a 20th century Russian literature class. So every publication entails a long list of agents of cultural production, or simply production, involved in the affair, from smugglers to publishers to critics to reviewers to people who exchange opinions privately in correspondence or diary entries. So such a project is, by definition, inexhaustible yet historically finite, right? So we have the end date of roughly 91 and the start date of 56, which is the beginning of the thaw era, because under Stalin no books were smuggled out. It was too dangerous and too impossible. So it only began 3 years after his death. And such a project is only, of course, possible as a team. So you can see volunteers who have contributed their time and efforts to the project. Volunteers come from all different countries and different backgrounds. And because Tamizdat was a truly international network, it is kind of reflected in the backgrounds of the volunteers and the languages they worked with, translating book reviews from French, German, Dutch, Ukrainian into Russian and or into English, because the website is bilingual, and it would make very little sense to make it only Russian, because that was not the nature of Tamizdat. Tamizdat was also much of it was about translation into foreign languages. Right now, I hope this would be uploaded and become the feature of Tamizdat project website sooner rather than later. It will have visualization where you could trace the movement, really, literally the progression of a manuscript from the drawer to publication, and then you would see a cluster of reviews around it, right, around the first publication, as well as kind of visualize on what global scale this phenomenon was based, really, because it pretty much covered the whole world. There were publishing houses in the Soviet times in Australia, in Canada, in, of course, New York, Paris, Germany, etc., etc. So, and there are relevant excerpts from a variety of genres: memoirs, book reviews, personal correspondence, documents, diaries again, that comment and allow to reconstruct the history of the publication and reception of all these works that at least the Russian reader considers canonical today. Yeah, so this has been very, very exciting, although I would probably never finish this project. But at least it is something that is happening. Again, thanks to the technology, but also thanks to the interest of an entirely new generation of people. First of all, the volunteers, who are mostly students, who are somehow very interested in this today, answering our question of what lessons could be drawn.
Right.
It is not only from Tamizdat project, it is from the institutions that have supported it, such as the Library of Congress and the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center and the Hoover Institution Archives and CUNY and the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. Somehow it is seen as a relevant and probably important topic, despite the fact that it's very much historically removed from today's reality.
Yeah,
So,
it does seem to have a real relevance. I mean, for me, I'm very interested in it from personal level, publishing and censorship and all that. But I think that people do have this sense of kind of lacking right now of a real dissident literary or artistic culture. And so I do think there's something there that people are perhaps drawn to.
This probably, of course, yeah, dissent will probably never go away, and luckily, because without it, it's not democracy, it's not freedom without dissent, whatever kind, but also because of the nature of books. Books are also becoming electronic and can easily be downloaded much cheaper than hard copies. And the project is precisely about hard copies, I'm sorry, which allows the new generations of readers to see what that kind of experience used to be like.
Yeah, and the importance of the physicality.
Right, especially when they can see the manuscript, a type script, or handwritten text, which was what people used to read before it became a publication.
Right.
That was what people read, not Kindle and not iBooks.
Yeah, it was a different time. So thank you so much, Yasha. I really appreciated it. And it's fascinating to look at, I mean, all the particulars of Tamizdat and also your thoughts on today and everything, how that relates. So thank you so much. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.